James Perloff, you picked up the story about Pearl Harbor.
Well, thank you so much. And, of course, tomorrow is Pearl Harbor Day, and some people might wonder, is that still relevant? And, of course, it is, because Pearl Harbor, which is how I opened my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, Pearl Harbor was just one in a series of false flag events used to provoke us into war. A lot of young truthers today know about 9/11 and the holes in the government's explanation for that. But today we're going to talk about a very important event that brought us into war some 70 years ago. And I'd like to touch on several things today, if I can, Stan. One would be what was really going on in that war, the Soviet Illuminati objective of removing Japan as a barrier to communism spread down into Asia. Then, as you've already touched on, Franklin D. Roosevelt's provocations towards Japan, his decision to base the fleet in Pearl Harbor against all sound military advice, Washington's foreknowledge of the attack, and finally, if we have time, I'd like to go into the post-Pearl Harbor investigations, which scapegoated our commanders in Hawaii.
You go right ahead. I think all those are very, very valid points.
Okay.
People
well,
don't even realize
in World War II, you'll notice that there was an hypocrisy of protesting fascist aggression, but not Stalin's aggression or communist aggression. If you look, for example, in the European theater, the war began when Poland was invaded by Germany, and immediately, of course, September the 1st, 1939, you had France and England declare war on Germany. Yet Stalin invaded Poland that same month, and what was the reaction? There was no declaration of war. Nobody was too upset by that. And at the end of the war, Poland lost its sovereignty to Stalin anyway. It lost its sovereignty, and that was supposedly what began the war, and nobody really cared. Well, over in the Asian theater, there's a very comparable situation. When Japan sent its troops into Manchuria, which we would consider the northernmost part of China, there was a tremendous protest, and it was said this is a part of Japan's plan to conquer the world. And yet what we were not told was that prior to that, Stalin's troops had gone into Outer Mongolia in the northwestern Chinese province of Xinjiang. There was no protest to that. And so people don't think I'm just talking here myself. Let me just quote what Anthony Kubik said. He was chairman of the Department of Political Science at the University of Dallas. Here's what he wrote in his book, How the Far East Was Lost. Quote, it was apparent to Japanese statesmen that unless bastions of defense were built in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, communism would spread through all of North China and threaten the security of Japan. To the Japanese, expansion in Manchuria was a national imperative. But the State Department seemed not to regard Japan as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. As a matter of fact, not one word of protest was sent by the State Department to the Soviet Union, despite her absorption of Xinjiang and Outer Mongolia, while at the same time Japan was censured for stationing troops in China, unquote. Dr. Anthony Kubik. Stan, I'd like to point out that, we sent troops in the 1960s to Vietnam to halt communism, we said, and we said that was a national imperative for us. That was a halfway across the globe. So how could we not say that Japan could do the same thing, looking at communism coming across the Sea of Japan, which is only 200 to 300 miles? And, of course, we have the Monroe Doctrine, which was articulated in 1823. We said we were not going to allow foreigners to come in and aggressively into our hemisphere. The Japanese were simply implementing their own form of the Monroe Doctrine, which said that they were not going to allow Stalin and the Soviets to come and spread communism into Asia. That's what was going on. But it was depicted here as the evil Japanese trying to conquer the world.
Well, you're absolutely right, James. And difficulty is most people do not know what happened at that time. They do not know that basically there is a planned program to bring about a world government. And the only way you're going to get this world government is through a series of wars. The First World War was to establish the League of Nations. And when that failed, they were going to have a Second World War. And that was going to establish the United Nations. And then, of course, when that failed, why the Third World War is inevitable. It's not a matter of when that war is coming. It's not a matter of if it's coming, it's when it's coming. They want to simply destroy existing civilization so they can bring about their new one world government. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm glad there's so much continuity, as you point out. The first, as world government with the League of Nations in the First World War, the UN the Second. You also have Zionism with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and of course the creation of the State of Israel out of World War II. And then you have communism taking over its first country out of the chaos of World War I with its Russian Revolution of 1917. And of course communism spreads over half the globe into Asia and Eastern Europe after World War II. Well, tonight's discussion is really about that.
Hold that thought, James. We're going to a break. When we get back, we'll have James Perloff talk about Pearl Harbor, which was simply just part of this movement to bring about a world government. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and basically it's very difficult to understand what's going on in the world unless you understand the underlying mechanism, the underlying belief of the people who really run things behind the scenes, and that is that they want a one-world government. And that's why, of course, we got involved, certainly, in the Philippine War, Spanish-American War. America got involved in that. That's why they had the Boer War over in South Africa, and basically then, of course, the First World War was to bring about certainly the one world government and the League of Nations. When that failed, why they needed a Second World War, that was World War II. And what people don't understand is that all during that war, American corporations, and we're talking about General Motors, we're talking about Ford, we're talking about IBM, we're talking about IT&T, we're talking about Exxon, we're talking about American banks, we're talking about General Motors, and basically they were building the weapons for the Nazis both before and during the war. But you had to have a war and kill a lot of people if we were ever going to get our world government, and that was with the United Nations. But when the United Nations failed, then we have had a series of wars since then. But we're building up now to a major war, another major war. It's not a matter of if, but when it breaks out in the Middle East over there, and may heaven help us, because in the other wars, we've been able to sit in our isolation comfortably. Oh, yes, we felt very bad about the American soldiers who were killed or wounded, but it didn't affect the average American. I fear the next war is going to affect everyone listening to this program, and believe me, it is being engineered by exactly the same people who created World War I and who left our boys there at Pearl Harbor to be killed on December 7th, 1941. Go right ahead, James.
All right, well, building up to Pearl Harbor, you mentioned that the Soviet Union wanted a war between us and Japan. And, quote, Benjamin Gitlow is a founding member of the U.S. Communist Party. Here's what he wrote in his book, I Confess, in 1940, after he renounced the party. He said, quote, when I was in Moscow, the attitude towards the United States was discussed privately with the opinion of all Russian leaders to whom I spoke that the rivalry between the United States and Japan must break out into war. I'll also quote our ambassador to Moscow, William C. Bullitt. He wrote this in 1935, quote, it is the heartiest hope of the Soviet government that the United States will become involved in war with Japan. The Soviet Union would certainly avoid becoming an ally until Japan was defeated, and then merely use the opportunity to acquire Manchuria and Sovietize China, unquote, Bullitt. And that's exactly what happened, of course. Now, in furtherance of the illuminated plan for a war between America and Japan, originally FDR tried to provoke Germany. We were having our destroyers depth charge German U-boats, and they were looking really for another Lusitania. A lot of our listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the Lusitania incident, which was contrived to bring us into World War I. And Franklin D. Roosevelt, who'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy at that time, and Winston Churchill, who had been the head of the British Admiralty at the time of the sinking of the Lusitania, were old hands to these false flags. Well, the Germans weren't going for the bait this time around. They would not retaliate. So Roosevelt turned his attention to Japan, and his Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, said, quote, our best entrance into the war would be by way of Japan, unquote. Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum, who was in naval intelligence, gave President Roosevelt an 8-step plan of provocation towards Japan, which we implemented, and it closed with these words, quote, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better, unquote. And you've already quoted Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who was, of course, in the Skull and Bones and Council on Foreign Relations. He wrote in his diary, quote, we face a delicate question of the fencing to be done, so to be sure Japan is put in the wrong and makes the first bad move. The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot, unquote. Henry Stimson, that's after a meeting with President Roosevelt at a cabinet meeting. 1941, seized Japanese assets, closed the Panama Canal to their shipping. And really, Dr. Stan, I think the timing of July 1941 was significant for these all-out measures against Japan because in June of 1941, of course, Germany and several of our allies, Hungary, Finland, Romania, and so forth, had invaded the Soviet Union. And there was great fear in Stalin's camp that Japan would now declare war and come in. He'd be caught in a two-front war, and communism would be destroyed in a vise. So it's very urgent that these provocations be given to Japan, and they had to turn their attention south where they could get the natural resources, the oil of the Dutch East Indies, for example, which was being denied to them by the embargo. And finally, Secretary of State Cordell Hull delivered an ultimatum to Japan on November the 26th. It was just about 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor, which demanded that Japan withdraw all troops from China, which would have given Stalin a free hand there. And, of course, the Japanese were not going to stand for that, and this was the immediate trigger for the decision to go ahead and attack Pearl Harbor. But if you have time, I'd like to talk about the decision to base the fleet at Pearl Harbor, which was such a critical decision. When the fleet commander, J.O. Richardson, heard about this order from Roosevelt, he flew to Washington, and he gave a whole litany of reasons to President Roosevelt why this was a terrible idea. For one thing, ships would be boxed in like sardines, which if you look at a map of Pearl Harbor at the time of World War II, that's exactly what they were. They were lined up next to each other, very ideal targets for bombers. Of course, Hawaii is approachable from 360 degrees of uninhabited waters, so it's an ideal place for a surprise attack. We had to supply the fleets across 2,000 ocean miles. Personnel changes had to cross the Pacific. There was limited dry docks and oil storage in Pearl Harbor. 37% of the population was of Japanese ancestry, making it ideal for espionage and sabotage by the Japanese. And being separated from their families would cause morale problems. So J.L. Richardson went to Washington and gave Roosevelt all these reasons why we should not base the fleet in Pearl Harbor. And the only reason Roosevelt could give him was that he said putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor will act as a deterrent towards Japanese aggression. Well, let me tell you something. As of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew that Roosevelt was wrong, and that putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor would not deter Japanese aggression.
Well, let me James, let me just mention for our listeners, Admiral Richardson was the commander of the Navy, American Navy. And when he heard that President Roosevelt has ordered that the fleet be stationed at Pearl Harbor rather than on the West Coast, he wanted, certainly Admiral Richardson and the Navy wanted to actually station the Navy, the Pacific Fleet, or certainly here on the Pacific Coast where it would be safe, and certainly but Roosevelt insisted on putting it at Pearl Harbor so it would be an ideal target. They wanted a target. They had to get a lot of Americans killed before they could convince the American people to go to war. The American people didn't want to go to war with the Japanese any more than the average American wants to go to war with Iran today. There is going to be an incident. I don't know what it is, but there will be an incident that will provoke a war with Iran, and that whole area of the world will go up in flames. I fear it'll be a nuclear war. But it is like certainly deja vu all over again. In 1941, the American people didn't want to go to war. Pearl Harbor then gave the justification for the war, and the same thing is going to happen today. Go right ahead, James.
Well, you're absolutely right about Richardson, and there's always a false flag, whether it's the sinking of the Maine, the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, Tonkin Gulf, 911, you name it. But to get back to J.L. Richardson, he was fired after meeting with Roosevelt, relieved of his command, and he complained to the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and said, it's very unusual for a commander of the fleet to be relieved from his duties without being given a reason. And the only reason he could be given was that he'd made President Roosevelt unhappy. That was the word
Hold the thought. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest is James Perloff. And James has written a number of books, and we carry his books, specifically his latest one. And James, why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners how they could get in touch with you, your website, and the names of a couple of the books that you've written that they should be ordering.
Many of your listeners are probably familiar with The Shadows of Power, Harbor, which I wrote some years ago on the history of the Council on Foreign Relations, and many people have asked me for an update on that book, and my new book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, is really the update to that. It's available in Kindle. It's available in paper-bound through Amazon. It's available through your ministry, Radio Liberty. You can get it through bookstores. And unfortunately, I lost the website due to criminal activity before, but I'm rebuilding one. It'll be called jamesperloff.com. But to pick up our story on Pearl Harbor, Stan, can I go ahead with that?
You go right ahead.
We're talking about the firing of Admiral J.L. Richardson. He was replaced as Pacific Fleet Commander by Admiral Husband Kimmel, who trusted that it would be okay to be in Pearl Harbor as long as Washington supplied him with all their intelligence information, but they didn't. And this is where foreknowledge of the attack comes up. Washington knew of the Pearl Harbor attack in advance through several means. One was we had cracked their diplomatic code. This was called the Purple Code, a very complex code that had to be enciphered by machine and deciphered by machine. And the Japanese thought it could not be broken, but we had talented cryptanalysts in our War Department who cracked that code, and they built their own machine. So we're reading Japan's diplomatic traffic on a same-day basis. And those messages were always sent to Chief of Staff General George Marshall, to FDR and 8 other high-ranking officials. And these revealed, for example, that the Japanese had given their ambassadors in Washington a deadline of November the 29th, and the message said after that things are automatically going to happen. November the 30th, 1941, they informed their Berlin embassy to tell the Germans that, quote, the breaking out of war may come quicker than anyone dreams. These intercepts revealed that Tokyo requested the spies in Honolulu to divide Pearl Harbor into 5 areas and report on a regular basis the exact locations of ships in dock. Now, this was not reported to our commanders in Hawaii. We also had translated a declaration of war before we received it. In addition to this, the Japanese had another method of communicating with their smaller consulates and officers which were not equipped with a decoding machine. They sent them they had pre-planned to send a radio message. If war with the United States was coming, they would send the message Higashi no Kaze Ami, which meant east wind rain. East wind meant the United States, rain meant war. And that message was sent on December the 4th, was picked up by our listening post, and everybody in the War and Navy Department in Washington knew about it, but not in Hawaii. There were also personal warnings given to Franklin D. Roosevelt. Our ambassador to Japan, Joseph Grew, sent him a message in early 1941. He said, quote, the Peruvian minister has informed a member of my staff that he's heard from many sources, including a Japanese source, that in the event of trouble breaking out between the United States and Japan, the Japanese intend to make a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor with all their strength, unquote. Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe was a U.S. military observer in Java, which the Dutch then controlled. The Dutch had decoded a Japanese intercept indicating the Pearl Harbor attack. Brigadier General Thorpe was so important that he sent a total of 4 warnings to Washington, and he was finally told to send no more warnings concerning Pearl Harbor. You can see him interviewed in the BBC documentary Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor. That's on YouTube. The Dutch military attaché in Washington, FGL Weigeman, personally warned our Chief of Staff, George Marshall, about the attack. J. Edgar Hoover warned the president of the attack based on information he got from Dusko Popov, who was a double agent working for the Germans and us, but his true allegiance was to us. He learned from the Germans about the Pearl Harbor attack in advance, and he warned J. Edgar Hoover, who passed the information on to the president. Senator Guy Gillette received information which he shared with the president, and Martin Dies, congressman from Texas, let me quote him, he had come into information concerning the attack on Pearl Harbor in the form of a Japanese map, and here's what he wrote, quote, as soon as I received the document, I telephoned Secretary of State Cordell Holt, told him what I had. Secretary Holt directed me not to let anyone know about the map. Instead, he would call me as soon as he had talked to President Roosevelt. In about an hour, he telephoned to say he talked to Roosevelt, and they agreed to be very serious if any information concerning this map reached the news services. I told him it was a grave responsibility to withhold such vital information from the public. The Secretary assured me that he and Roosevelt considered it essential to national defense, unquote. Congressman Martin Dies. And Stan, in addition to this, many decades later, through the Freedom of Information Act, Robert Stinnett, in his book Day of Deceit, proved that we not only broken Japan's diplomatic code, but their naval code advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the opening of hostilities, he'll attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X Day, exact date to be given by later order, unquote. So, Dr. Stan, there was no question that Washington knew through many, many sources that the attack on Pearl Harbor was coming.
And, it's so difficult for people to believe this, but all you need to do is remember, if you've ever seen the pictures of the attack on Pearl Harbor, they had cameras set up all over Hawaii. Now, remember, this was Sunday morning. Everybody was in church, and yet the cameras were all set up to take the pictures as soon as the attack began. And it's so reminiscent of what happened, certainly, on September 11th, 2001. Did you ever wonder why we had cameras focused on the Twin Towers that morning that could show us the planes coming in, and certainly we've seen those pictures over and over again of the planes circling around the South Tower and crashing into it. And then, of course, we've seen the pictures of what happened at 5:20 in the afternoon when Building 7 came down. And it wasn't just one camera, it was a whole flock of cameras centered on Building number 7. Why did they have all those cameras centered on Building number 7? There was no time to set them up. The Building 7 came down in 6 seconds. Those cameras were set up ahead of time to take the pictures, to program these thoughts into your mind, just exactly as the cameras were set up on December 7th, 1941, so that you would see this and you would come to hate the Japanese and were willing to go along with this totally unnecessary war that was planned not certainly to bring freedom to people throughout the world, but to bring about this one world government, which FDR was totally dedicated to. Go right ahead.
Well, I'm glad you brought up 911. We heard remember Pearl Harbor, remember 911, we shall not forget, right? Well, it's interesting that in September 2000, which is just a year before 911, I'm sure you've heard of the Project for a New American Century. A lot of CFR guys, Pearl, Wolfowitz, and so forth, they issued a paper called Rebuilding America's Defenses, and it called for increased U.S. military presence in the Middle East. But here's what they said, quote, transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, unquote. And Dr. Stan, it's very interesting that in May of 2001, which is just 4 months before 911, Disney, which has not recently been known for its patriotism, released a very patriotic film, Pearl Harbor, starring Ben Affleck, which, of course, gave it the standard rendering and portrayed Washington as being totally surprised by the attack, which was not.
It really was. And incidentally, that's Rebuilding America's Defenses. If you want to get that, you can get that from my ministry. We actually have it. It's about 80 or 90 pages, but well worthwhile reading. Certainly what happened, certainly on September 11th, was planned ahead of time, another Pearl Harbor. Our telephone number, if you're out there in the listening audience, you have a question for our guest, of course, is 1-800-259-5791. 1-800-259-5791. Our guest is James Perloff. His book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Truth is a Lonely Warrior. It's an excellent book. In fact, as James tells us, that wasn't the title he was originally going to use. What was the original title? It had to do with Satan. What is it?
How Satan rules in the world, but I was told I would reduce the book's marketing, so I picked something a little more artistic sounding. But it's Truth is a Lonely Warrior, and I should probably mention, I want to make sure I do before the show's over, where people get more information about Pearl Harbor, documentation of the things we're saying today. My book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, does begin with Pearl Harbor, but I've also written articles for the New American Magazine in years past, which are online today. If you just go Perloff, write in Perloff, Perloff, and Pearl Harbor, those will pop up for you.
Well, Dr. Stan here at the Genesis Communication Network. Our guest, James Perloff. Our telephone number, 1-800-259-5791. 1-800-259-5791. If you have a question, go right ahead, James.
Yes, before the break, we were just talking about resources. I will have an article tomorrow, Pearl Harbor Day, on Henry Mako's site, MAKOW, which will give people links to resources. But in addition to that, you could, some of the excellent books on Pearl Harbor include John Toland's Infamy, Robert Stennett's Day of Deceit. If you people like to watch videos, there was an excellent excellent BBC documentary that you can now see on YouTube. It's called Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor. And, of course, there was Admiral Kimmel wrote his book, Admiral Kimmel's Story, and Rear Admiral Robert Theobald was in Pearl Harbor on that day, wrote The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor. Those are just some of the resources that document what we're saying in a very limited amount of time today. Well, Stan, we've been talking about the foreknowledge of the attack, and then after the attack, of course, there was the cover-up. And because people were demanding accountability, Congress and the American people wanted to know why we had thousands dead and 18 ships sunk or heavily damaged at Pearl Harbor. Why were we caught off guard? So President Roosevelt appointed a very chummy commission, it was called the Roberts Commission, to investigate Pearl Harbor. It was headed by Owen Roberts, who he was very friendly with, Supreme Court Justice. He was a big one-worlder who had been making lots of speeches about the need to get into the war. Also, two officers from General Marshall's staff who'd been in on the foreknowledge of the attack, as well as retired Admiral Joseph Reeves, who'd been given a job in Lend-Lease by Roosevelt. And the Roberts Commission, after spending time in Washington and in Hawaii, issued a report saying that Washington had discharged its duties in a superlative manner, and all the fault for Pearl Harbor was our commanders in Hawaii, Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet commander, and General Walter C. Short, the Army commander in Pearl Harbor. It said that they had failed to take adequate defensive and surveillance measures. Well, this is just nonsense. We denied them the ability to do that, and we've not shared any of the information about the break in relations with Japan or the threat to Pearl Harbor. Let me just quote Rear Admiral Edward Layton, who was Kimmel's intelligence officer, who said, quote, "There was never any hint in any intelligence received by the local command of any Japanese threat to Hawaii. Our air defenses were stripped on orders of the Army chief himself. Of the 12 B-17s on the island, only 6 could be kept in the air by cannibalizing the others for spare parts," unquote. They couldn't surveil all the waters around Pearl Harbor. They didn't have the planes for it. But you know what, Dr. Stan? We had hundreds of surveillance patrol quality planes which were rolling out of our factories, but they were going to Russia and to Britain instead of to our forces in Pearl Harbor, who scapegoated the commanders there for this attack.
Well, there's no question at all. In fact, we have an excellent tape set on Pearl Harbor where we actually interview Robert Stinnett and other people who were intimately involved with what happened that day. So basically, that's a 4-tape set available from Radio Liberty of 4 very important interviews. They're all available and there's a companion book that goes along with that. Our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927. If you'd like to get that and understand how we left those boys at Pearl Harbor to die so that the American people would be willing to go to war, just exactly as we left those people in the Twin Towers in 2001, so that they would die, so that the American people would be willing to go to war. And there's going to be another incident. I don't know what it's going to be. But somehow or other, they're going to create an incident to justify getting us into a war with the Muslim world. And heaven help us when that occurs, because basically there's a lot of countries over there with nuclear weapons. And basically Saudi Arabia, my information is they already have the nuclear weapons. After all, they paid Pakistan so they could build them. Pakistan definitely has them. Iran has them. Israel has them. And there's going to be a terrible carnage taking place, but perhaps not just in the Middle East. Well, Robert, what are the thoughts James, what are the thoughts you'd like to leave with our listeners today?
How much time do we have?
Oh, we'll give you a couple of minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, I just did want to mention that at the demand of Congress, there was trials that were held by the Army and the Army Pearl Harbor Board and the Naval Court of Inquiry. See, the Roberts Commission ran a very unusual investigation, unrecorded testimony. Kimmel and Short were not allowed to have attorneys present. They finally they wanted court-martials. Finally, the trials were held in 1944, which proved that Washington had foreknowledge of the attack. But Roosevelt ordered the trial results of the Army Pearl Harbor Board and the Navy Court of Inquiry to be suppressed from public knowledge. In the meantime, he hired a couple of investigators who would get many officers to reverse their testimony. So when they finally released results of the Pearl Harbor Board and the Naval Court of Inquiry, the public never knew what really happened. But you really have to get those resources that I mentioned earlier and see my article on henrymakow.com, or get my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. I begin with Pearl Harbor, and we walk the reader through the various false flags, Lusitania, sinking of the Maine, Tonkin Gulf, 911, that have led us into wars. And Pearl Harbor, it's Pearl Harbor Day tomorrow, was part of that continuum, a very important part. But people really need to know what the truth is and what's going on. They won't find it in the mass media because the major mass media is controlled by the same forces that brought about these events.
You're absolutely right. And basically, ladies and gentlemen, they left those boys at Pearl Harbor to die, like they left the people in the Twin Towers to die, and they're going to sacrifice so many people here in America with the coming World War III. James, thank you very much for being with us. It's always a pleasure.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much, Dr. Stan.
God bless. Okay, well, that was James Perloff. His book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. We carry the book. We think it's important. Truth is a Lonely Warrior, and you can get it by calling 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. Now, because we do